All right, so this is 141, and we're down here with authenticated encryption. So let me bring up these slides. All right, just looking to see if that, yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay. So last time we talked about message authentication codes, where you add a signature sort of tag to a message, and then you can verify that the message has not been altered. I think I'll make this a little skinnier so it doesn't get cut off. All right, so that gives you authenticity, but it does not provide confidentiality. That's just like a hash value attached to the message, a little bit more than a hash value, because it has a key, so you know not only that it has not been altered, but you know who sent it. But what we want is authenticated encryption this time, where we're going to create not an authentication tag, but also encrypt the message. So you'll have confidentiality and authenticity and integrity. So there's various ways to do it. The simplest way is you just use a MAC, message authentication code, and then there are a variety of more sophisticated ways to do it, of course. So 800 leak code exercises. Boy, I didn't know there were that many. Yeah, I saw, I think a student here, Twisted did like 100 days of doing like Hack the Box or something, and that's a great thing to do. Anyway, so, all right, so a MAC. If you want to make a message authentication code, just a tag to attach to your message, one way to do it is take your plain text and encrypt it, and then take your plain text and calculate a MAC, and then send those two. That's encrypt and MAC separately. So now you have a ciphertext and a tag, which can be used to verify the ciphertext has not been altered and identify the sender. And these use two different keys. You have one key for the encryption and another key for the MAC. Or you could calculate the MAC and then add it to the plain text and encrypt it all and just have ciphertext that includes the MAC. Or you could encrypt the plain text and then take the MAC on the ciphertext. These are three general ways to do it. And in principle, if all the operations you're doing are cryptographically strong, each of these will be strong. But they are not equally strong if things go wrong. This is the least secure system in principle because, remember we talked about this over the last couple chapters, if you just take standard algorithms like SHA-1 or something and use them, that's one way to go, and of course it's convenient, but in a mathematical sense, you may not be using algorithms that exactly have the properties you need. And for a MAC, the hash functions you need do not have to have the property of being random and containing no patterns. Sometimes you could use a hash function here that in fact leaked information about the plain text, and it would still count as a message authentication code because it's only required to be unforgeable. And if you were to use a weak hash function to make the MAC, then this system would be insecure. Yeah. Yep. All right, so SSH does this. It does encryption and then MAC, and it uses a sequence number to keep track. And in practice, like I said, instead of using a MAC function that just has the minimum cryptographic desirable properties to be a MAC, they just used a standard one, HMAC SHA-256, which in fact also is random and doesn't leak any information about the plain text. So even though in principle this system is not the most secure, in practice SSH is fine because they just reused standard hash functions that had more desirable properties than were strictly required. Mac-then-Encrypt is another way to do it. Calculate the MAC, then encrypt the whole thing, which is pretty good. You can't see the plain text tag, so it can't leak information. So that solves the security problem of the previous one. It does have a more subtle security problem, though. You now have an encrypted message, and the MAC is in there. So you have to decrypt it first, then you can compare it to the MAC, and if it is a corrupted message or a malicious message, you decrypt it before you can find that out. You have to process it before you find out it's corrupted, and therefore if I was sending in some kind of corrupted attack message that was going to have an effect, exploit a vulnerability, it might exploit the vulnerability before you notice that it didn't pass the MAC test. So that's in principle a possible weakness of this. Your recipient does have to process some potentially corrupted data. But this is what TLS used until 1.3. And this is considered the most secure system. You encrypt it, and then you attach a MAC tag to the ciphertext. Now the receiver can check the MAC tag to see if the ciphertext is corrupt and not bother to decrypt it unless it is not corrupt, and then they decrypt it. So it seems to be the strongest and the best system, and that's what's used by IPsec, which is used by a lot of VPNs these days. Yeah. All right, so authenticated. Now what we just described are ways to get the job done by plugging together a couple of components. But, of course, now we can talk about the real point of accomplishing just this job. Now, what we've done, instead of just plugging together individual components that may not be optimum, an authenticated cipher is the overarching category of what we're trying to do here. And an authenticated cipher is where you feed in a key and a plain text, and after that you get ciphertext and a tag. And therefore, to decrypt it, you take the key and the ciphertext and the tag, and you retrieve the plain text. That's the idea. So we want to have that property available, which of course is the same thing that we just discussed does, but if you consider, now we can talk about what are the real security requirements for this. Your authentication should be as strong as a MAC, so you cannot forge a tag, or even a ciphertext tag pair, that would be acceptable. And confidentiality should be stronger than a basic cipher, because not only do you have the key, you also have to have the tag be valid. So there's two keys, really. So that's the plane here. So that's the goal. And so what you really want is this, authenticated encryption with associated data, because you might have some data that you do not want to encrypt, but you do want it to be verified. For example, you might be sending network traffic, and then you do not want to encrypt the addresses because they're necessary to deliver the traffic, but you do want to encrypt the contents. So you want to have data. This A is the associated data, which is not encrypted, but it is included in the tag. So you can verify that it's all intact and from the correct sender before you do anything with it. And then you process it. Does the tag, sit on the associated data? The tag verifies both the ciphertext and the associated data. So you can test them, and it won't pass that test unless both of these have been signed correctly by the tag. That's the idea. So you don't waste, your recipient can first check to make sure that the entire packet is valid, and they throw it away if it isn't. And so they do not even bother decrypting this or paying any attention to the addresses unless it passes the test. That's the idea. So if either one of them is modified, the ciphertext or the associated data, then this test will fail. The tag will not be valid. So that's the game. Now you can, of course, leave A or P empty. If you don't send any associated data, then it's authenticated encryption. If you don't send any plain text, then it's MAC, where you just attach a tag to plain text data. So this is the general mathematical structure that includes both of the previous things, MAC addresses and authenticated encryption. All right, now, you don't want it to be predictable. One thing about this is, if I were to have this key, plain text, and associated data, and then I have another block of plain text that's exactly the same, I'll get exactly the same output. It has the same problem as electronic codebook mode. So we know that's not good, because large-scale patterns in the plain text will be preserved in the output. So you need to have a nonce. And by the way, I read on some podcast what nonce is. Nonce is from n once. Somebody had n sub once in there. It's a number you use only once. That's what a nonce is. Anyway, so of course you need a nonce. So you have to, for each block of data, you have to have a nonce, and then, or I guess you would feed in a nonce once. I'm not quite sure. It might depend, but you feed in a nonce so that if you have another block of plain text that's the same, you have a different nonce value. That's the idea. Anyway, so to make a good authenticated cipher, you want confidentiality to be as strong as a good cipher, and authenticity as strong as a good MAC, and you want to consider if you repeat the nonce. That is a error that might happen. Does it have to be random? No, I think in most cases it doesn't. In fact, in counter mode, you just count up 1, 2, 3. It just has to be different each time. Yet no, in some it's not random at all. In fact, by the way, it's never random. It has to be completely predictable, because to decrypt it, you have to predict the series of nonces. So even if it's not just counting up 1, 2, 3, it is going through a predictable series of transforms, because you can't decrypt it without knowing them all. So, relay attacks. Yeah, well, avoids replay attacks. Yes, that's another one. Yes, it could avoid replay attacks if, well, that's another issue. We should consider that. See, if you had, let's go back to there. If I had this, if you had the same key, the same plain text, and the same nonce, and the same associated data, you'd have exactly the same thing. So actually, there's nothing here that prevents a replay attack. If this was your garage door opener, and you pressed a button, and it did this mathematics, and I recorded it, there's nothing intrinsic in this system that would mean the replay wouldn't work. You'd have to have something added outside it that records what nonce you're on and make sure the same nonce doesn't come through again, like we talked about in previous chapters. But there's nothing here that intrinsically prevents a replay attack, I would say. Yeah, there's nothing here that's necessarily sequence number. There's just a nonce here. You would have to add something that's outside this system, like a counting up sequence where you keep track of where you are. And therefore you know if the packet is coming in out of order. And that's not included in the system we're talking about here yet. You could add it, but it's not there. All right, so there's performance. You can parallelize it. That would be nice if you can calculate the blocks independently. And you may remember that was an advantage of counter mode for AES, which was not true of cipher block chaining. Cipher block chaining, you had to calculate one block and use the output as the nonce for the next block, and so you could not parallelize it. You couldn't, if you had multiple processors, only one processor could be working. So counter mode is parallelizable. Cipher block chaining is not. Counter mode, you just have 1, 2, 3, 4, so you can give them all to different processors. Each block is calculated independently. All right, so your internal structure might be 2 layers or 1 layer. If it's 2 layer, then you'd have first encryption and then calculating the Mac community authentication, like we said, and that's 2 layers, and that might require twice as many transistors on a hardware implementation. If you could combine them into just 1 layer of operations, that might be simpler and faster. And then there's streamable. If you have a long message, do you have to keep the whole message in memory, like make like 2 passes through it to get the answer, or can you just work with a block of data and throw it away and work on the next block and throw it away, which would of course consume a lot less RAM? So that's an issue. A non-streamable cipher has to store the whole message in RAM, and therefore it's not going to be able to handle a very large message. All right. So here's other things. Some authenticated ciphers only allow the authenticated data to come before the plain text that's going to be encrypted. Others let it go in different locations. Some require 2 algorithms, one for encryption and a separate algorithm for decryption. But counter mode can use the same for both. And, again, that would mean perhaps half as many transistors on your chip if you're designing a custom chip for this and you're worried about the cost. All right, so this is the one that is the official standard, the actual NIST standard, AES-GCM, which is Galois counter mode. I used to call this Galois, and I finally decided today I'm going to look it up and stop being an ugly American that can't pronounce anything. It's French. You're supposed to call it Galois, they say. So anyway, so Galois counter mode, instead of just using count 1, 2, 3, 4, it uses some mathematical function from Galois to calculate those numbers. That's what it does. And so it calculates an authentication tag. And this one is a NIST standard, part of the NSA suite with a NIST SP number, so it's the one officially approved by the government. Stuck on the streamable content. If it has 2 layers, does that imply it's not streamable? No, that's completely separate. Streamable just means that it doesn't need much memory. It only needs to handle 1 block, and then it can throw away and move on to the next block. That could be done with 1 or 2 layers. 2 layers just means you have to have 2 steps in the algorithm, 2 layers of silicon. They have to go through a whole process and then a second whole process. Or can they all be combined into one process? So they're separate. These are good questions. So this is the main one, of course, the official one approved by the government, and therefore the most popular, used in a lot of popular things like TLS 1.2. And here's what it looks like. You encrypt and then MAC. So here comes a block of data. You take the nonce and you add a 1 to it. You take the nonce and add a 2 to it here. And then you run them through AES. You take a first block of plain text here to get ciphertext. You take your next block of plain text here to get a second block of ciphertext. And then to calculate the tag, you feed in the associated data here and combine it with a polynomial thing and then an XOR and a polynomial thing and then an XOR. So it's this thing here is going to be the tag, which is going to include all the plaintext data. Plaintext went in here and here, and all the associated data is all going to go in the tag, and that creates the tag. So that's what you want. So if this tag verifies, that means that the associated data is right and that the plaintext is right. And notice you also keep track of the length of the plaintext. So you've handled the case they mentioned in the book where what if your data was all zeros and you were padding it with zeros, then you wouldn't know how much of it was data. So that sort of thing, it's good to have the length in here. So you do know what part of it is really data and what part of it is padding. And you're supposed to pad these things in a smarter way than just using all zeros. Anyway, that's the game. This is how Galois counter mode works. And it does this polynomial multiplication, which can be done with XORs. And the thing about polynomial multiplication is it's an operation that can be done very quickly on silicon. What's the last step at the bottom? Well, this is XOR, and that's this H thing, which is polynomial. That's all there are. There's XORs and polynomial multiplication. That's what they all are. One slide ago, this one here, right? ARN. So there's only two transformations. I hope that helps. They're applying AES one more. Oh, yes, they do apply AES one more time. Yes. So you take the nonce itself and encrypt it and include that. I don't know why. This is the nonce with a 0 at the end, nonce with 1, and nonce with 2. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why that's there at all, really. But it is there. You're right. You do 3 AES encryptions for some reason. Actually, you do 1 AES encryption per block of plaintext and then one more. Yeah. All right. So anyway, this is not good if a nonce is used twice. If the nonce is used twice, they can deduce the key. Yep, apparently to Mac-then-Encrypt. And therefore you can forge tags. And so you're not supposed to let the nonce be used twice, and they tested just a few years ago, and a bunch of servers were found to use repeated nonces, and a bunch of them with all 0 nonces, which is not good either. And that's the thing that comes up a lot in all security news and every chapter of this book. The point is, you make this mathematical system, but then real people have to program it, and they will make mistakes. And what happens when they make mistakes, and in practice, of course, a lot of people do make mistakes. That's like the test a few years ago where they just looked at all the public keys of all the HTTPS servers and found thousands of them that used the same prime numbers, which messes it all up too. So if anything can go wrong, it will. It's worth asking what would happen if you misapplied it by making a simple mistake like repeating a nonce. So they're both parallelizable, encryption and decryption, but not the Mac. It's streamable because the layers can be pipelined, so that's good. You do not need to hold the whole thing in memory. Yep, there will always be errors. There will also always be side channel attacks from the hardware. You're never going to get away from any of those things entirely. All right, so this is the one that is the standard that everybody uses it. It has a few weaknesses, but it's not terrible, and everyone pretty much uses it. And just like everything, every chapter of this book, there is a standard that was defined a while ago, and there are better new ones that most people are not using yet because the old standard is good enough. But in new products, and as we move forward, presumably people will move for these newer ones. So OCB is one faster than Galois counter mode. And the only problem is the author did not donate it to the public domain. The author patented it and wanted to charge money for it, and that prevented people from using it. It's better, apparently, with one key in one layer, encryption and authentication. It does all these things to optimize it. And so you take each block of plain text and encrypt it with a block cipher with a key in the offset, block by block. Here's your plain text. And all right. And the last time you combine these with XOR and encrypt that, and that's what makes the tag. So this includes all the plain text and makes a tag. And so the tag uses the XOR of all the plain text, and it's got an offset calculated from the last block's offset. I don't understand what S is, though. Nope, I don't understand what S is. Anyway, So the point of this thing, it has associated data. It works too on that. And so it's considered quite good. You can handle repeated nonces better. You won't be able to find the secret key, and it's considered just fine. Parallelizable and streamable. And at one time, it was actually 3 times faster than AES on early Intel processors. So anyway, it's the cat's meow, but because it was restricted by patent, it did not become popular. Although he apparently has released a patent recently for non-military applications, so maybe some people will switch to it, but in the meantime, the other one became a standard. And so S is the XOR of all the plaintext. Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, is S the XOR? Yeah, that's it. Thank you. S is the XOR of all the plaintext. Good. Okay, that's what's used to make the tag. That makes sense. So, this is what you get. You have something that just has the mathematical properties you need instead of taking components that have extra properties you don't need. So SIV might be the best. Synthetic IV. Even if you use the same nonce twice, it doesn't matter. And you'll only see a repeat if the whole plaintext message, not just one block, is repeated, which is pretty impressive. So you have an encryption function, a pseudo-random function, 2 keys, and a nonce, and you calculate your tag from it and your ciphertext from it. And so the tag acts as the nonce of E. So you calculate the tag and use that for the nonce, for the encryption, which is not a bad thing to do. I guess that's the part that makes it a synthetic IV. The tag is used as the IV down here for this encryption. And so it's not streamable, which is a problem. You have to pass through the data twice. So that's a limitation. But anyway, it's another option, considered strong. Then there's permutation-based, where you don't use a block cipher. Instead, you transform the input to the output of the same size. So this reminds me of RC4 that we talked about before, that just shuffles the bytes like cards without really doing normal kind of encryption. It does it reversibly without using a key and is considered to be fast and secure. So permutation, which you have an initial state. This reminds me of the SHA-3, the keychack function with a sponge, where you have an internal state which is longer than your block size. You have this internal state with a lot of bits, and then you XOR in the key and the nonce, and then you XOR in the plain text, and then you permute, run it through a permute function, just shifts things around, and then you add some more. So you start with the key and the nonce and put that in, and permute it in. Then you take some plain text and mix it in. You take some more plain text and mix it in. And then when you're done, you take some of the bits and call that the tag. This is very much like how SHA-3 works. So you've got a series of pseudo-random blocks, and you XOR them with plain text blocks to form ciphertext blocks. So you have an internal state, which is big, and some of the bits are the tag, and the ciphertext is the same length as the plain text. Yeah, it's very much like Spongy. It's obviously based on the same general idea. And so you have to keep the internal state secret. If that internal state with many bits is to leak, that would ruin everything. And you have to carefully pad the blocks. Nonce reuse doesn't really matter very much. And it's single layer, combining everything in one layer. Like we said, that would be, and it's streamable. Same algorithm at both ends, encryption and decryption, but not parallelizable. All right. And so we can talk about the attack surface. So you want confidentiality and authenticity, your plaintext and associated data. You want your algorithm to be able to withstand a chosen plaintext attack, where you can choose special values of plaintext and associated data, such as, for example, all zeros or empty, and it shouldn't leak anything out that matters. That's one issue. You must be able to collect numerous message tag pairs and not break in. Almost all the attacks against TLS, like the Beast attack, the Crime attack, Lucky 7, there's about a dozen of them. They all rely on getting millions and millions of encrypted tags by just doing many HTTPS requests. But that's something you can really do, so you have to watch that. And the nonce is likely to be reused sooner or later, and you should be able to withstand some of that. So it turns out that Ghash, used in Galois counter mode, uses this hash key over and over again for each block. And the problem is, just like RSA, which we're going to talk about, there are certain values of the hash key that make the tag weak. Because what you're doing here, this is the same thing we did in the Pollard's row. You have the hash, and then you take the hash it again, and then you hash it again and again. You just keep repeating it, iterating it. So you take the hash of the hash, the hash of the hash of the hash, the hash of the hash of the hash of the hash, and so on. And as we know, that will eventually find a loop and just go around the same values over and over. So these additional terms are not really new numbers. And that's an issue. And if there are short cycles that repeat every few blocks, then that's pretty bad. For example, if you have a cycle of 5 values, then what you're hoping each one of these will be multiplied, each block of text will be multiplied by a different value. You're actually repeating the same values over and over. And that means you can do something like this, which is this is DES-ECB, where each block is independent. But see, if you have a web request that has the parameters here, random number is this number, app is token, username, Waldo, user ID is 0, and so on, then you can take blocks of ciphertext and swap them. So if I have a user ID of 0 here, I can turn it into a user ID of 1 by just swapping those 2 blocks. So you can swap blocks, and it'll still be valid because you have a cyclical pattern in the parameters. So this is a weakness. It's probably not a very serious weakness in practice, but it is a fundamental weakness in the system. There are certain values of that H parameter which are dangerous because they have the property of repeating in a short cycle. All right. In practice, it's very difficult to exploit because you can't figure out the cycle length unless you know H or K, and those are the secrets you're not supposed to know. It's a theoretical defect of it, but in practice, it's not easy to exploit. All right. So another issue is Galois counter mode, Galois counter mode can use tags of different lengths. Now, if you use a 128-bit tag, you're fine. If you were to use shorter tags, it wouldn't be safe, which seems pretty obvious, but in fact, it's worse than you think. A 32-bit tag has 4 billion options, so you might think you'd have to try 4 billion times to get one that matches, but it turns out to be much weaker than it appears. You only need to get up to the square root of that. So, if you have a 48-bit tag for a long message, instead of having 1 in a million squared, you'd have 1 in a million chance of forgery succeeding. So it is not as secure as it ought to be for short tags. But for 128-bit tags, it's good enough. And so, like most of the other algorithms we've talked about, the standard is good enough. But it is kind of inefficient and does have some weaknesses that have been addressed by these later algorithms that haven't really caught on yet because nobody's much motivated to move off the standard until it is really, really broken. All right, so let's take a look at some cahoots. And of course, most people just want to use the government standard, right? I mean, why would you use anything else? You want everybody to understand what you're doing, and that means they can easily comply with all their compliance rules because you're just using a normal thing, you know. Most of the time, you just want to use the government standard, unless you have really good reason not to. Otherwise, people don't really know what you're doing, and they don't know whether they can trust it. All good. A couple of my classes, we only had 3 competitors, and that sort of reduces the competition. But anyway, got a good batch today. All right, so what system does not provide confidentiality? All right, that's the Mac. That's just a tag added to a message to verify it, but it does not encrypt it. All right. Which one is the standard? This standard. Yeah. All right. That's GCM. All right. It's not perfect, but it is the standard and seems to be good enough. Which one might leak information about the plain text? Encrypt and Mac. Good. The Mac might in principle leak information. All right, which one can tag data for authenticity but not provide confidentiality? Yeah, it's a little bit confusing question, but that's what AEAD can do. It can add data, which is one way to use this is to do that. You can send data that is not encrypted but is authenticated through AEAD. All right. Yeah, I realize that question might be a little misleading. Anyway. Enrique looks like a name. That's a name. And I know who that is. All right, good. All right, let me stop this recording.